Welcome everyone to today's CPCS InfoSite webinar entitled Delivering Value, How Project Sponsorship Helps Public Agencies Deliver Better Transit Projects. And while I make the introductory remarks, we're going to be launching a poll so that you can tell us a little bit about yourself while we get started. So feel free to just go ahead and answer these questions while I introduce the panel and the panelists, and then we'll take a look at the results before we dive into the conversation. So the poll should hopefully pop up on your screen right now. And if you don't mind, please just share with us a little bit about where you're coming from and your experience with this topic. So my name is Ian Griffiths, and I'm a principal consultant and the U.S. Transit Practice Lead at CPCS, based here in San Francisco, California, and I'll be moderating today's session. CPCS is a global transportation planning and infrastructure advisory services firm, and we help infrastructure leaders make better transportation decisions that maximize value for the public, deliver on organizational missions, and are environmentally and financially sustainable. And we work across the project lifecycle from feasibility studies all the way to construction and operations. So why are we here today? Many regions across the world are trying to improve the mobility for the public by making major investments in public transit projects, such as new high-speed rail systems, new subway and light rail projects, rail electrification projects, bus rapid transit lines, expanded stations, new maintenance and operations facilities. However, public agencies tasked with delivering these projects often struggle to accomplish everything that is expected of them. Planning and delivering projects that attract new riders, expand access, or reduce emissions, that somehow balance all the needs of competing stakeholders, and all the while keeping within a reasonable budget and completing within a reasonable time frame. Project sponsorship is a set of practices for managing these large, complex infrastructure projects. It aims to ensure that across an entire project lifecycle, the benefits of a project are consistently evaluated, tracked, managed, and ultimately delivered. So today we have 3 expert panelists that will be sharing about how project sponsorship works, what it is, how it works at their respective organizations. They bring a range of perspectives and decades of experience with project sponsorship from both the private and the public sector side. So I'll introduce them each, and then we'll dive into a discussion. So for our first panelist is Carol Devaney, Project Sponsorship Practice Lead for CPCS. Carol is a recognized global expert in project sponsorship. In fact, she literally wrote the book on it, and here it is right here, How to Sponsor Projects from 2023, a practical guide to sponsoring projects and business change. She led project sponsorship for Network Rail in the UK and then set up Metrolinx's project sponsor office. And she founded Sea Change Consulting, which recently merged with CPCS. So we're really thrilled to have Carol now as part of the CPCS team of global experts. Our second panelist is Will Gallagher, who is the Chief Strategy and Development Officer at East West Railway in the UK, and who established the sponsorship directorate there. Before joining East West Railway Company, Will was the operations director for the National Citizen Service Trust, the fastest growing youth program in the UK. And then finally, we are pleased to have Nadine Navarro, Vice President and Head Sponsor for stations at Metrolinx in Toronto. Nadine has 20 years of experience in transportation planning and project development across Canada and beyond. She is a licensed civil engineer, having studied at McGill and MIT, and has contributed to major project advancement in a range of jurisdictions and specializing in managing complex stakeholder networks. So in terms of format, we'll start by having Carol provide an overview of project sponsorship and her experience in this area. Then we'll have Will and Nadine introduce a little bit more about how project sponsorship works in their organizations. And then we'll have some Q&A and a bit of a discussion. Please feel free to write any questions and comments that you have in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. To keep us on time, everyone is going to be muted except for the panelists. And if you miss anything or must leave, that is totally fine. We are, of course, recording this session. We will be sharing the link to that with you afterwards if you have registered, as well as posting it on our website for you to share with anyone else. And we'll show our email addresses at the end of this if you have any follow-up questions for any of the panelists. Before we go to Carol, let's bring up the poll results just to see where people are coming from. So unfortunately, the first question was, what country are you joining from? And it was a short answer, but I am not at least able to see what people's responses for. So we'll go to the second question. What kind of organization do you work for? And we have 57% at private companies, about 18% from public agencies, 7% nonprofit, and 18% other. How familiar are you with project sponsorship? 54% are a little familiar. So there's a basic understanding, 11% not at all familiar, about a third of people are either very familiar or have actually worked as a project sponsor. And then in terms of what are the biggest challenges in delivering major projects, delivering promised benefits is the biggest challenge at 40%. Keeping on schedule and budget is next, and managing stakeholders, all significant challenges. Of course, these are probably challenges for every single project, and we'll be talking about each of those in a little bit more detail. I do think we have a mix in terms of where people are joining from. I know based on the registrations, we have a good mix of people from North America, Canada, the US, as well as from the UK, Africa, and across the world here in many different time zones. So thank you again for joining us, whatever time of day it may be for you. Okay, with that, we'll take away those poll results and we'll go to Carol. So Carol, can you please tell us about some of the basics of project sponsorship? What is it? What kinds of organizations and projects are practicing it, and what are some of its key advantages?
Sure. And I'm going to be really brief because I'm going to talk about the theoretical concept of sponsorship. And of course, theoretics are not that useful in projects. Applications are useful in projects. And that's where Will and Nadine have got lots of valuable advice to share. And I'm sure we can mix some of our experience together because we've all worked together as sponsors at various times in various ways, solving exactly the problems that people are facing in these big transport projects. So sponsorship, first of all, is a project profession. It's not really just for business as usual. It's for when you have new things to do that require a project or a significant business change. And the sponsor is essentially a person who is the first in the project and the last out of the project, because they are there to really lead the project as the advocate and be the person ultimately accountable for the success of the project. And that's important because projects need someone to take ownership, to say that the finality of decisions that lead to the success will stop with me. Now, that doesn't mean they're the person making all of those decisions, but they are the person making sure those decisions are made, because indecision is one of the most expensive things in transit projects. The complexity drives a lot of those difficult decisions. So the sponsor is really there to be the guiding mind of the project and lead the project to make sure those crucial benefits are delivered. And it was interesting to see that was the biggest problem, because sponsorship is quite often a difficult role because they are focused on delivering those benefits at the end. And that's hard to keep people sighted on that throughout these complex projects that last quite often years and have evolutions as they go through. So I would say sponsorship is very much a contextual piece. So the nature of your organisation and your project will determine exactly what you need sponsors to do. But traditionally, they would do things that are typically along the lines of owning the business case, owning and ensuring the benefits are delivered, leading the corporate and project governance. And those two things don't always align so easily. And the sponsors quite often sitting as the pivot between those two. They will manage the key stakeholders and sort of conduct the stakeholder orchestra to either get support for the project or to protect the project, because as we know, sometimes stakeholders have huge expectations, and if we don't gather those at the beginning, we don't want to add them in during delivery. They also quite often help determine what the project boundaries or scope are. They quite often own the funding decisions and some of the commercial direction and strategy, and they lead the link between, and this is really crucial in transport projects, they lead the link between what the business wants, what operations need, so that we deliver projects that can be operated and deliver passenger benefits, and what the project team need to do. So they're a pivotal link between that benefits delivery because of where they sit in that space, because Funders are rarely asking us to build transit or transport for the sake of it. It's actually about what does that transport allow people to do? What does it enable? And that quite often is a tension between operations, business, funders, and the people trying to deliver these complex projects, very often in live environments. Not many people do projects as complex as that in live environments where we also still keep people moving. So that is really what the sponsor does. I think you asked what organisations do it. I would say it really differs across the world. In the UK, I can't think of many transit agencies that don't have sponsors. They pretty much all have them. They have different formats, and you'll love Will's perspective on it because it's a little different and novel. However, it has worked extremely well for that organisation. So it feels like a proven model now. I'm actually asked where people dial in from. I'm actually in Canada today, although you might tell from my accent, I am not Canadian. Um, and I would say that Canada is probably the biggest where we're seeing an interest in growth of sponsorship. It does happen in the US as well. If you've got federal funding, it's mandated that you have a sponsor. So it does happen there too. Across Europe and other parts of the world, we definitely see the model, sometimes called sponsorship, sometimes called something else, but definite interest in it, especially in such a time of geopolitical change and economic instability. The role of sponsors more and more coming to the fore as we try and protect those project benefits. What are the advantages? Two key ones for me. One, more likely to deliver projects on time and on budget. And two, you're more likely to deliver the benefits if you have sponsors.
Thank you, Carol, for that great overview. And we'll be coming back to you shortly. So next, let's hear from someone who is running a well-established sponsorship program, William Gallagher of East West Rail. So Will, can you tell us, first of all, what is East West Rail? And tell us a little bit about the projects, the sponsorship program there, how it works, and what kind of impact you think it has had.
Great, Ian. So, Will Gallagher. I'm the Chief Strategy and Development Officer at East West Railway Company. East West Railway Company was set up about 7 years ago now to sponsor the development of East West Rail, which is a railway that connects Oxford and Cambridge in the UK. You might have heard of both of them as world-leading universities. They are also massively growing economies driven by the likes of life sciences, high tech, advanced manufacturing. But each of them on their own, they're about 80 miles apart. But to get between them, there isn't a straight road. There is definitely not a straight railway line at the moment. And either you take a 3-hour bus, which is great when you're a student, not so hot if you are trying to get to work, or you come into and out of London taking the tube somewhere in between. So what East West Rail is all about is unlocking £78 billion worth of economic growth by expanding the labour markets of both Oxford and Cambridge, expanding the opportunity for businesses to grow geographically, not in expensive places like Oxford and Cambridge, but in the places in between, which is what East West Rail joins up, and also creating the scale of cluster. So Oxford and Cambridge individually are a few 100,000 people. They don't compare at that scale with Silicon Valley, which is a global competitor, or Boston, which is a global competitor, which are millions of people. And so what East West Rail does, by joining up those two places and the community in between, creates a place or a region that is fully joined up, that takes about an hour and a half to get across, that is at a scale that competes with Silicon Valley or Boston, as an example. If you look at it in pure traditional transport benefit terms and a conventional business case, using, so the UK has a sort of set of quite strict rules for how you quantify the benefits of a project. It doesn't capture many, if any, of those major economic benefits. And so at East West Rail, we were very focused on how you build a much more compelling explanation of what those economic benefits were, how the transport intervention unlocked them, because that was absolutely fundamental to unlocking the investment to get the project off the ground. And that was where building the right sponsorship function was absolutely critical. And what we did, and and Carol will tell you about this, there's on one level, a sponsor can be a jack of all trades and a master of none. On one level, that's a good thing, because it's about how you balance a whole load of competing sort of specialisms or interested parties. I wanted to make sure we never had a sponsor who was essentially a postbox passing information from one bit of an organization to another, but actually, I see our organization really as the sponsor of the project. We have a small team of actual sponsors who help glue the all the various parts of the business together and run the system that means you can actually make those trade-offs. But we do, as part of that sponsoring organization, have people who are engineers and environmentalists and operators and analysts and project managers and constructors, because we want to make sure in that sponsoring organization, we've got that whole set of skills reflected, and then we manage that set of trade-offs. We bring them to the fore, we analyze them, and that drives the decisions that we make. And the skills of our professional sponsors, as it were, are there to enable that trade-off to happen, to focus on the way you bring that information together, the work you do to manage those trade-offs and to balance those opinions, and the behaviors you need to create, because a lot of that sort of trade-off work is behavioral. A lot of these individual specialisms and subject matter experts do not like their views being traded off one against the other, but that is fundamentally what a sponsor's or a sponsoring organization's job is there to do. So that is very much the approach that we take. It is particularly important, I think, to do that when you have a transformational project. And a lot of the projects that are getting investment around the world now are not there because they take 2 minutes off this or 3 minutes off that, or they're being done because they unlock big economic opportunities. Bluntly, there isn't enough money around at the moment to invest in small stuff. You've got to invest in big stuff that has big rewards. What that means is the role of the sponsor in understanding the real trade-offs is really important. And I'll just give you one example at East West Rail, which I think sort of epitomized for me the way good sponsorship drives the right decisions and guarantees project benefits. We had a choice when we were picking the route for East West Rail about whether we approached the city of Cambridge via a northern route or a southern route. It's very classic in early stage project development, the kind of thing that a sponsor would be involved in. The operators thought we should come in from the north. It was simpler to do that. The engineers thought we should come in from the north because, bluntly, it was at least as easy, if not easier, to build and potentially a bit cheaper. But when you look at the investment case for East West Rail, which is about access to jobs and connecting jobs with homes, the reality is, by coming in from the south, you put an East West Rail station within walking distance of 3 times as many jobs as you do if you come in from the north, and the knowledge-intensive industries that are around that station are of a completely different category than if we'd have come in from the north. So the south was much more valuable in economic terms. Believe me, aligning the parties to get that outcome and get that decision made when no amount of conventional modeling would have supported it, and the traditional trade-offs wouldn't have got you there. It was the strength of our sponsorship model and the kind of analysis that we do that meant we were able to get that decision over the line, actually persuade the British government to invest more money in taking that route, but then driving better outcomes as a result. The really interesting thing is once we'd taken that decision, it was then further the sponsorship model that we have that went, right, I know you've told us it costs more, but actually, if we were a bit more imaginative and looked at the way the operations could work and the land that we really need to take, what we in fact have done is both approach Cambridge from the south, taken a route actually through Cambridge Station, and headed off further to the east, because operationally, if we do that, we don't need as much land. The operational solution is easier, and we need fewer platforms at Cambridge Station. Finding that solution then closed the gap, so it actually cost no more than it would have come from going to the north, and it delivers more benefits because it unlocks more housing growth in the east. But that again only came from a sponsorship model that said, we've got this decision through and it's the right decision, but we can still continue to drive optimization and push the design. And it's one of the reasons why, again, just to conclude my thoughts on this, it is really important that one, you create that sort of outcomes-driven mindset, not just in your sponsors, but across that sort of broad swathe of experts that you've got. And two, that your sponsor is fully integrated into that decision making at a technical level. If they are not in that discussion about the way the operations and the infrastructure and the consenting work, if they're not in those discussions and in those decisions, you won't get decisions happening at that level that drive the right outcomes. Sitting somewhere above that, a project team answers to just doesn't get you there. And that's why we shaped both the organization and our sponsors the way we did, because it was fundamental to delivering the benefits that East West Rail was being invested in. Does that get me there?
Yes, that's a fantastic intro, and we'll go. I have many questions, but as I'm sure many of our audience members do, and do drop those questions as we go along in the Q&A. Also, the chat, it looks like, is open, so that's an option too. But now let's go over to our final panelist, Nadine Navarro, the head sponsor for stations at Metrolinx, an agency that has set its sponsor office up a little more recently, and with the assistance of Carol Devaney. So Nadine, can you tell us about what you do as head sponsor for stations at Metrolinx, and how the sponsor office there has grown, evolved over time, and how it is helping Metrolinx?
Yeah, thank you. Happy to. So Metrolinx, of course, is a large organization. It's an agency of the government of Ontario. My focus specifically is on stations, primarily GO stations, which is essentially regional rail. And as Carol mentioned, it's the complexity of these station projects while running a railway, getting passengers to and from, and managing operational impacts. The work that we cover is a range of existing station refurbishments and improvements, which range in scale themselves, as well as new station projects, both ones fully funded by government and those that are part of the Transit-Oriented Communities, or TOC program, which of course ties into kind of more specifically housing objectives and other priorities that we are kind of trying to achieve as a government. The focus of sponsors, building on what Will said, at the end of the day, so much of what they think about is trade-offs, and what I think about it is trade-offs and managing competing objectives and the variety of things that we're trying to achieve as an organization. So the work includes defining and refining project requirements to achieve business case or policy objectives, managing and shepherding through governance, and then at the end of the day, it's really about decision making. So as Ian said, the sponsorship office has existed, I'd say, in the order of 7 years. Carol may be able to correct me in a moment. And initially, when it was set up, It was focused, it was very small, focused on very big fires, tricky stakeholders, key government briefings, and it did what it had to do, kind of just getting in there, but it's certainly been evolving over time. And of course, it was being inserted into projects that were well established in terms of their life cycle. So, adding value from day one, but in a different way than we're evolving today. So over time, we collectively have a deeper understanding of the projects. So sponsors have a better ability to kind of catch things when they're risks before they're issues, versus that kind of just firefighting kind of mentality. There's also a better approach that as we evolve to in the trade-off world, managing operational impacts and customer impacts with project objectives. So of course we want to manage time and budget on a project. However, if it's going to have a major impact on people that are using the system every day, that's a very important trade-off question that we think about all the time. And then the culture at Metrolinx has evolved as well, certainly as sponsorship is more embedded. And the lens of kind of benefits, like what are we trying to achieve, is much more upfront in terms of decision making and how we even talk about projects, which is wonderful. And then in terms of how we are improving projects, again, clearly defining what we are building and why. So those kind of detailed requirements, and then that also is important in terms of what we are not building. So what we do not need to include in a project in order to achieve the same benefit. Because as we know, costs are incredibly challenging to manage in our current environment. Applying that lens, kind of best for business, then again, that really speaks to the trade-offs, because there's a lot of really good objectives and KPIs that people are trying to hit, but we have to have that kind of what are we trying to achieve as an organization, and that involves some very difficult trade-offs, and that's throughout the entire life cycle of planning, procurement, and then of course construction, and then getting it into operations. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of how sponsorship has improved our stations projects is just enabling just more deliberate decisions, but the right people in the right location and the right documentation and communication, and that's related to internal as well as external. From the stakeholder perspective, that's a key part, of course, of our role, and just I think we just make better decisions at the end of the day.
Great, thank you, Nadine. Well, I have a question. I'm going to start us off with a question. Thanks for there's several that have been added to the chat already, and my question I think relates to some of them, or a couple of them that have come in. So I'm wondering, we have two examples here with Metrolinx and East West Railway of different project sponsor, two sort of different places where project sponsorship seems to be residing. It's East West Railway, it sounds like it is an organization that was created in a way explicitly to serve it in this function, whereas Metrolinx is an existing organization that created a project sponsorship function within it. So the question is for anyone really, what type of entity is best positioned to become a project sponsor? A state government, a funding agency, a special purpose entity, and how is there a right model, or does it really depend on the project and the context?
I'm happy to start us off if you want, Ian, and then I think definitely bring Will and Nadine in. And they are really different models at Metrolinx and East West Rail, and I would say that's absolutely appropriate because they are different organisations doing different things, and in very different contexts. I can tell you a little bit of the humorous side to how I met Will Gallagher is because I was head of sponsorship at an organisation, and Network Rail won't mind me saying this, we had a very difficult few years because we had changed our sponsor model in a way that actually didn't work, and things were not going so well. Our portfolio was in a little trouble. It was, front page headlines. We were not politically popular with the people who were providing us, significant amounts of funding. And I had just moved into the head of sponsorship role at that organisation at the time that our politicians had frankly had enough. And one of them phoned Will and one other person and said, these people are not doing well when we give them money. You have to set something else up and do it better and prove that it can be done better and then make them do it that way. And that doesn't sound like a great way to start, a sort of long-term relationship. However, Will got in touch with me and said, well, how's it going for you? I said, well, it's terrible. We're in a bit of a mess, Will. I've been brought in to try and fix some of this, and here's what I'm trying. And we started to talk about, well, East West are going to do something different. And actually what we started to do was sharing what's working well, what's not. Will came from actually outside of industry, which was really refreshing because he could look and see, you're asking too much of the people that you're asking this of. That was his key point. We had a huge portfolio, and some of this might ring true with Nadine over at Metrolinx. When you've got an enormous amount of funding, you're trying to climb a hill very steeply, very quickly, because you want to capitalise on the investment, but you've also got so much to do all at once, and it's a big ask from sponsors. So Will actually we ended up working together on building this different model led by his thinking of, there is a better way to do it. And I kind of thought, well, this is great, because I would have to go to the market and pay someone to figure this out. If there's a better way, let's see it, let's see them pilot it, and then we will adopt it. But I think your model can be different, and it really should be bespoke to where you are. And I mean that geographically too, because the politics are different, the environment's different, the funding context is different, the culture is different. And it should then be relevant to what's the portfolio you got. And I would say, if you have one project, you're not going to stand up a sponsor office, hire people in to help you do it, and then finish it. If you're going to do this forever, then you're probably going to stand up a sponsor office relative to your context.
Will, did you want to add? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think for me, I think sort of two things here. The first is, wherever it sits organizationally, I would very much be in what are the basic characteristics of the people you need, and the characteristics of the team that you draw on. So what I mean by that is, I think to be really effective, I would make sure your sponsors themselves are really good synthesizers who have enough understanding of why you're doing something, but are sufficiently interested in how you get it done to get the outcomes that you want. Because if you're only focused on the why and the benefits you're going to deliver, you can't get that translated into what is actually being delivered. So you've got to have that synthesizing capability. It's hard to find, recruit for it, and look hard and test it. And we have, I have a case study that I do with every single person we interview for a job that is all about testing your ability to analyze and make trade-offs in an informed way. But then rely on experts in your organization from across project delivery and engineering and operations and customer and environment, because you will never be as good as that as a sponsor. I wouldn't hire sponsors who, like your environmental sponsor, your engineers, they use actual specialists in your organization and have your sponsors as the synthesizers in the middle of all that. The second point I would make is, and this comes up in another one of the questions, in terms of the interaction, particularly in government-funded projects, between the sort of sponsoring department, that provider of the money, and the sponsor, perhaps in the more delivery organization, and they are very different roles, but they are often misunderstood. So you either end up with your government side sponsor trying to do too much of what the delivery side sponsor the development side sponsor should be trying to do. And that is a recipe for man-marking, second guessing, and not getting on very well with your funder at all. Conversely, if your sponsor on the delivery side doesn't get that their job is to reach deep in and understand what's going on in the delivery, and just thinks all they need to do is what the funder does, then bluntly, you're not going to drive the outcomes and those benefits, because exactly as I was saying, the why and the how have to be connected, and that's what that delivery response does. So being really clear on how those two roles are different and not duplicating in either direction is very important.
Yeah, thank you. That this gets at, I think, a question that Simon Harding asked in the chat: where and how should a sponsor be held to account for the delivery of a project? Sometimes it is very easy to expect a sponsor to know as much as the project manager, but there are blurred lines, and so, you know, how do you overcome this in a large organization? You know, you've emphasized the need for the distinguishing of those two roles, project manager and project sponsor, but you know, play this out. I'm wondering how like, do you have an example, or how does it typically shake out when you do have a conflict there? There, to me, there needs to be some senior level board leadership kind of ultimately judgment call on these issues. So how does this relate to the overall senior, you know, board leadership of an organization, and how important is it that they understand what sort of basic principles of project sponsorship are? This could be for anyone.
I can start from the Metrolinx perspective. So to that end, the organization needs to know what they're getting themselves into. So, you know, who is making what decision, I think is the key part in terms of whose accountability it is. And there are going to be boatloads of problems on any given project. And it's going to be really critical that the relationship between the delivery lead and the sponsor is strong, and that they trust each other, because they are going to be shoulder to shoulder, kind of standing in front of a board or, you know, an executive group when something has gone wrong. So I think that's a really critical part. And so that you know, the board or whoever it is asking questions or receiving bad news also understands, you know, how we got here and who's doing what. So that all speaks to, you know, how the sponsor role is introduced, that whole change management piece, because when it is inserted in an existing organization, as Carol mentioned, and as happened to Metrolinx, the change management is critical because, you know, nobody here knew what a sponsor was, you know, 10 years ago. So that it's to set yourself up for success, you really need to, you know, more broadly than just kind of tell someone they're a sponsor and kind of go for it.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll follow that up by saying, let's say the audience here is convinced that, you know, project sponsorship is a valuable practice, that and there's been many folks, though, do not have this kind of practice in place in their organization. It's not certainly coming from the United States. It's not something that many transit authorities have. They don't have offices that are called that, and even functionally, that's not really how. Whether they call it a project sponsor, they call it something else. They're not really set up with those clear roles distinguished. So what would be the first step for someone who's here today who wants to take the first steps, maybe is responsible for a specific project or a program of projects? What would be the first steps that could be taken to move towards a project sponsorship approach? You know, this is for anyone. I imagine Carol has been in this situation often. You know,
I was going to say my first piece of advice is ring Carol.
Thanks, Will, because that was your action, and I think that's worked pretty well over the years. I think it'd be good to ask Will and Nadeem what they think has made the biggest difference, because the reality is anyone who's in the position of thinking about starting a sponsor office, they're not doing it in isolation. They're not sitting thinking, I have a lot of money, time and resource, let me start this from first principles and build it up. You know, you can look at the whole sponsor maturity model we have and say, these are all the great things to do in sequence. That'll take you 10 years to get a mature sponsor organization. Generally, there will be specific challenges that your organization is facing that you need the sponsors to fix first. So I would say really understanding where those are and the nuance of that is going to be where you first go. But it'd be interesting to hear from Will and Nadine what those challenges were for them and where they think the big differences were made, because no one's doing this in a pure, you know, starting from zero, we've got 5 years to do this, let's go for it. Everyone's got a burning platform, especially transit agencies just now.
I can say that I think there's probably two parts of it. One is, bringing in someone who knows what they're doing, who's done this before, as well as kind of a double act, someone who really knows the organization and deeply understands the challenges that they're working with. So I think that would be a really powerful kind of starting point combination, because as Carol said a moment ago, there's some really important theoretical pieces, but the individual situation and culture and environment will have to shape, how it goes. So I think that would be an important piece at the outset.
Yeah, no, I think that's I think that's absolutely right. I think for me, there is you sort of need to triangulate between, what's the project you're working on and what's driving it. So we're big in terms of the billions of pounds and geographic reach. And we were very early stage with some big choices to make about things like route that would be driven by, or should have been, or needed to be driven by outcomes-based thinking. So that led you to a particular view of how pervasive we wanted the sponsorship model to be. There are smaller transport projects where you would take a different view about how far you would push the model. Also, are you a sort of single purpose vehicle looking at at one mega project? Are you a portfolio organization trying to manage and optimize across that portfolio? Are you an organization that just has one project it needs to do? And if you are, is it, where is that rested within the organization, and what does the overarching governance structure look like? So you end up needing to understand your project and your organizational context, because if you see sponsors as the glue between different bits of organizations that allow you to make those trade-offs, you've got to work out what you're trying to glue together to get to the right outcome. I do come back, though, that whatever structural choices you make, I think there are characteristics of a good sponsor, like at a personal skills and capability level, that bluntly are the same in all circumstances. And I suspect, actually, if you find at a senior level the right person who's got that set of skills, they will actually help you navigate or analyze your project characteristics and your organizational characteristics to get the model right. And that's why you either hire that person or you bring them in as consultancy of somebody who's got the experience of doing it.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question. I have a comment, and then I'm going to go to at least one more question in the chat here. So I had a little bit of an aha moment when I was preparing for this webinar and flipping through Carol's book, and which was that prior to working at CPCS, I had worked for a couple of different transit agencies in the planning departments of, including a stint at Metrolinx, but also here in the US. So involved, many North American agencies have planning departments that are involved in early stages of transit, expansion projects, looking at doing feasibility studies, also looking at station upgrades, transit-oriented development projects. And my experience was, as a project then moved into design and construction, other groups would become involved, capital projects, real estate. And I, as the planner, was often asked to continue to stay involved, to really, realizing I was sort of being asked to be the project sponsor to ensure that, well, why did we come up with this project in the first place? And you need to continue to work, be with the project to make sure that as it moves into design, like, we don't lose sight of some of, why we're doing it in the first place. So in my opinion, like, at least in the North American concept, planning departments are maybe logical places where, to be able to start from in terms of establishing, a sponsorship function, because in some ways they're already being asked to fulfill that role, even though it's not necessarily always articulated very clearly as well, the differentiation between the project sponsor role as that versus the project manager. So I'm just curious what Carol or anyone else, if you've observed the same thing of planning departments becoming sort of the de facto sponsors, even if they're not called that, and the value of potentially formally designating something as a project sponsor versus just sort of informally doing it through a planning department.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that, Ian, and I've seen that actually in other countries, not just the US, where the sort of strategic thinkers, the people who've defined the policy and set those outcomes, end up almost like you say, as the de facto sponsor. What then tends to happen is they are stretched very thin, continuing to create new policy, new planning, new strategy, and trying to oversee, once a project goes into delivery, trying to make any sort of changes, like trying to change the course of a super tanker. It takes a lot of resource, a lot of energy, and sometimes they're not kind of outwitted, but they're outwilled by a project team who are now in charge of the money, who are going in a very specific direction, and that might not always have kept that link to the benefits. And it might also be that these projects take a long time. Some of us have worked on projects that take 10, 15 years to get into delivery, and the world changes. We're living in a post-COVID world of transit where frankly we're seeing some pretty big changes having to be made in projects that are in delivery, because we need different benefits from them now. We need different outcomes from them. And that's quite hard for someone who is doing a full-time planning job to be asked to just transport themselves over. Some people do it superbly well because they've got the breadth, they've got the seniority, they've got some of the levers. But I think without the official designation, you're asking people to do an awful lot of influencing that some people will be able to do, but they'll be exhausted by the end of it. And quite frankly, you need a little bit of a different skill set in delivery. And it's a little bit what Will said about it might be that the planner is a great person to send someone to do that work for them and say, this is what I need you to do as oversight and direction, but asking planners to be those great strategic thinkers and be in the detail of projects and delivery, especially where they have big portfolios, places like Metrolinx that have the biggest transit portfolio and delivery in the world. You can't ask the planners there to also be overseeing that and making the plans that go beyond it. Nadine has actually worked in a lot of different planning organisations and in delivery, so I'm sure she'll have a view on what she's seen and what's worked well.
Yeah, I think while a lot of the skills are similar, I do think it is really important to have a distinction between planning and sponsors. Now, lots of planners make amazing sponsors, so there is certainly that it's transferable. But you would want some kind of distinction to be more successful. And it's also, for the organization, it's also clearer when that role is distinct in terms of decision making, kind of who's accountable for what. It's just provides more clarity.
Great, thank you. Here's a question from Fraser Towers. Do you think a single individual can sponsor a project from inception to close, or do you see sponsors are best aligned to a particular part of the life cycle, given how much the role changes as projects move through delivery? Anyone, but I feel like Will, because he's sort of stayed with East West Rail and has been on it seems like a specific project for a very long time. Seems like it's possible to have perhaps that continuity, but do you have opinions on this one?
Yeah, I do. It's actually very hard because definitely the skill set you need as a I'll reframe that. The work you are doing in the development phase of a project as a sponsor is very different than the work you're doing at the delivery end of sponsorship. And they're both vital. They're both really important to protecting the benefits, but they're markedly different. I think in the end what we did, and Carol will remember this, is we sort of balanced the team out by having a combination of development and delivery type sponsors, because you need that blend, because day to day it's different, but at a fundamental level you want to hold on to that benefits focus, and the team needs a bit of a blend. That's what we in the end decided. If you're at one stage in the project, we're lucky we've got multiple stages happening in parallel, so having the blend is relatively easy for us. But the thing to guard against, particularly if you've got sponsors working for you, is delivery phase sponsors who are good at the delivery job sometimes actually lose a bit of perspective on the benefits focus. It is hard. Likewise, development phase sponsors can, if you're not careful, optioneer forever. And so what you actually have to do is you do have to balance that skill set. And the more senior you get as a sponsor, your skill is to basically watch out for those two tensions, which is why we're lucky. We've got a big enough sponsor team, and we've got projects in multiple stages of their development to manage that and to check and balance each other.
Great. So the answer seems to be ideally you have some people who are continuous, and you have some subject matter expertise that is, specific to each project stage, so you get the best of both worlds. If you can, which to me speaks to the advantages of having a more portfolio. If you are within a larger organization, you can probably more likely have all of those skills within, and keep all those people busy on numerous projects, versus setting up, something just for a single project. I'm wondering how, we're almost out of time here. How are so I'm curious what one question for Will specifically is, how big is the sponsor office at East West Railway? But the reason I'm asking that is, how are sponsorship offices funded typically? Obviously, setting up something like a sponsorship office requires some upfront funding, which involves making the case that perhaps we should take some of the capital budget and use it for more upfront tasks. And this is where I think, Carol, you have some data on how project sponsorship impacts the overall budget of projects, timeline of projects, likelihood to get completed. So yeah, two-part question here. How big is the sponsorship office at East West Railway as well as at Metrolinx? And Carol, what are some of the arguments that you could use to make the case to sort of allocate some funding to set up that function early on in a project phase, in terms of how it might save you money later
on? So think about the scale of the investment. We're sort of probably 6 to 7 billion sterling total. I joke with the business that we're actually 200 sponsors. And the reason I joke with the business that we're 200 sponsors is because I believe at this stage in a project's development, you're pretty much all sponsors because you're doing the development. And that was my point about having subject matter experts and using them rather than expecting a huge mass of sponsors to be your sort of jack of all trades, masters of none. So what that means is our whole organization I see as a sponsorship organization. I'm sure the project team wouldn't necessarily agree with me, but that's part of the fun of it. In terms of actual named sponsors, we're smaller, so we're 6 or 7. And that's because I don't want sponsors who are second guessing my experts. I want sponsors who are synthesizing my experts.
Great. Nadine?
So yeah, we're obviously set up very differently than East West Rail. So for the Go side, I mean, the investment is in the tens of billions Canadian, and we are probably in the order of 20 plus. I don't have the exact number at hand, but it's quite a decent team.
And then Carol, anything you can share around how to make the case for obviously you don't start by setting up a department of 20 people necessarily on day one, but at least to get started on exploring this type of function, what are some of the key arguments that, or the data that you have on how this can relate to, you know, saving on time and budget, which is obviously always an issue, but especially right now in a number of different regions pursuing transit projects?
Sure. I mean, the first thing I would say is this is a capex cost. So we sometimes speak to clients who are saying, well, this all feels like an operational cost because I have to hire people, you know, in terms of, you know, the basics of tax regimes. You should be looking at this as a capital cost because fundamentally it comes down to if you don't have projects or significant business change, why are you hiring sponsors? So, you know, it very much aligns to that. But there also is a lot of empirical evidence. So I always say, I don't worry about how many sponsors I would have to hire on a project because I can measure whether they pay for the return on investment, because there's empirical evidence that, you know, on projects, only around about 40% of projects finish within the original budget. But there's research that shows if you have engaged sponsors, and engaged is the key word there, then actually that goes up to 66%. So your chances of being on budget much higher. But crucially, and everyone focuses on time and on budget, and of course we should. You know, I'm a project person at heart, and those are important. But actually, it doesn't matter if we build it on time and on budget if we don't build the right things that do the things we wanted them to, because that's a waste of money, and we don't have, you know, to Will's point earlier, we don't have that money to waste. And these are hugely disruptive projects in the communities that we work in the towns that we live in. Whether you use transit or not, you will be disrupted by those projects. So we have to be able to show we actually got those projects benefits that we promise people. And actually the chances are, you know, 46% of projects is what the evidence shows that we get in terms of delivering the benefits. But when we add in engaged sponsors, that goes up to 77%. So actually the data is there to support that these investments in having sponsors, and of course, right size it, right shape it, you know, make sure it's the right people, but actually we can get those returns within our projects. And that for me, I like an evidence-based answer, and that's the key for it.
We are unfortunately out of time, and we'll need to wrap this up. A big thank you to Carol, Nadine, and Will for joining us today, as well as all of you who have joined online. We'll be sharing the link shortly, as well as hopefully a few of the key insights and observations from the conversation. On the screen right now is the contact information for Carol and myself. Please, whether you have questions for any of the panelists, you can email Carol and I. We'll make sure we get you responses or put you in touch. Or if you'd like more information on project sponsorship, please be in touch. In summary, those 2 points around project sponsors being focused on outcomes and the essential quality of them being deeply embedded in the delivery of the organizations are really two key takeaways for me. And yeah, I hope everyone learned something today, and we'll look to do perhaps more infosites like this and dig deeper if there is interest. So please let us know what you thought by being in touch, and have a great day, everyone.